After the filtration in the glomerulus with the blood and the capillaries in the Bowman's capsule, it now turns into what we call filtrate and goes through the proximal tubule. So in the proximal tubule, it's reabsorbed. Um, there's all these things that are going to be reabsorbed by the paratubular capillaries. So these are capillaries that run alongside the proximal tubule, and that's our countercurrent exchange. So they're running opposite direction of the proximal tubule. So the things that are reabsorbed, 75% of the salt, the NaCl, is reabsorbed. The sodium molecule is reabsorbed by active transport, and then chlorine follows by diffusion. So chlorine says, hey, I'll go too. All right, and 75% of the water is also reabsorbed through this diffusion. All right, then also glucose and amino acids are reabsorbed by the capillaries. Everything else stays in the filtrate in the proximal tubule. So then after that filtrate goes through that reabsorbed process with the capillaries, then it's called urine at that point. And then it goes through the loop of Henle, which has a descending limb and an ascending limb. So the descending limb has a high permeability to water. So it will, and a low permeability to salt. So it gives off lots and lots and lots of water in the descending limb of the loop of Henle. Okay, and then in the ascending limb of loop of Henle, it has a low permeability to water and a high permeability to salt, NaCl. So it is freely giving up salt. So that keeps that osmotic gradient up. So here's your water given off, and there's your salts being given off. All right, then continuing, we're still in the reabsorption phase. So there was filtration, now we're in reabsorption still. The distal tubule is the next part after the loop of Henle. And in the distal tubule, we reabsorb salts, potassium, and NaCl. And we also reabsorb water and bicarbonate, which helps to control pH. We also secrete hydrogen ions. So this hydrogen ion and reabsorbing bicarbonate, giving this off, so this secreted hydrogen is given into the urine at this point, and bicarbonate is given off by the urine at this point. So we're reabsorbing all these things. And the H plus, K plus, we're all regulating the pH of the urine at this point. All right, then we fall into our secretion process. So as the filtrate moves through the tubules, that hydrogen, potassium, and ammonium are secreted from capillaries into the tubule. And that regulates our concentration gradient. So we're kind of keeping it even between the blood and the urine. So from the capillaries into the tubule, or vice versa, dependent on which one has more. All right, after that secretion step, there's a little more reabsorption and then excretion. So all of this goes into the collecting duct, and in the collecting duct there's more water reabsorbed, and then you end up with the excretion. So ureas pass through to the bladder, so urea goes off to the bladder, then the bladder controls the concentration. So if you're dehydrated, you need more water in your system, it will reabsorb more water, and your urine will be more concentrated. Whereas if you're overhydrated, you'll have dilute urine, and it won't reabsorb quite as much water. All right, so how is all this reabsorption achieved? Well, that is this osmotic control. So we have a tight osmotic control to reduce the energy cost of excretion. We use diffusion instead of active transport wherever possible. So we've got that countercurrent exchange system. This is running up where the capillaries are running down. And so we're going to have this exchange system between the two. All right, some hormones in the kidney. The first is vasopressin, which is also known as, it's more commonly known as ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. So it comes out from the pituitary gland, and what it does is it increases the permeability of the collecting duct to water, so it absorbs more water and gives more concentrated urine. It'll take more water out of it, and so you end up with concentrated urine. So that controls the amounts of urine. So obviously if there's a lot more water in your urine, you're going to have a larger volume of urine. The other hormone that plays a major part is aldosterone, which comes from the adrenal gland, and it has an effect in the distal tubules to help reabsorb more salt and water. And this plays into increasing blood volume and blood pressure. So, in summary, what is not filtered out are cells and proteins because they're too big. And then what is reabsorbed through active transport is sodium and chlorine ions, as well as amino acids and glucose. So those are active transport. The other ones through diffusion, sodium and chlorine in different places are absorbed either by active transport or diffusion, and water is reabsorbed through diffusion. What is excreted is urea, which is highly concentrated, excess water, and excess solutes like glucose or salts, along with toxins, drugs, or unknowns. So that's all for the kidney excretory system. So then, regulating the internal environment, this regulation of homeostasis, and we're going to talk about the skin as an excretory organ as well. So homeostasis, we started off talking about this, so we're back to it. We've got osmoregulation, which is solute balance, as well as the gain or loss of water. We also have excretion, which is the elimination of nitrogenous wastes. So we just talked about the excretory system in that sense. And then thermoregulation, to keep our temperature in a tolerable range. So we talked about endotherms and ectotherms. So first, in homeostasis, to keep at a stable state, we have this negative feedback loop. Something happens, so it's a stimulus saying, this is different than we were before. A sensor says, hey, look, we're different. This center compares conditions to our set point, says, here are our conditions, here's what we should be at. Then this effector will cause changes, then we end up back at the set point, back where we're supposed to be, and the loop is completed. So it compares conditions to the set point, we're at the right place, nothing changes, we stay in a constant state until something makes it change again. So here's it again. So some body condition, if it's high, this sensor triggers this gland, which gives off a hormone, which lowers the body condition, and we return to the set point. Whereas if it's low, give off a different hormone, we'll return it to the set point again. For example, our nervous system controlling our body temperature. If our body temperature is high, our brain sends nerve signals, which cause us to sweat, which dilates the surface of blood vessels. And if our body temperature is low, our brain sends nerve signals, which causes us to shiver, which constricts the surface of the blood vessels and helps us stay warmer. All right, so we just talked a little bit about this, maintaining our water balance. So that is your blood osmolarity, the amount of dissolved material in the blood. So let's say you're dehydrated. We have increased osmolality of plasma, and then those osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus say, I'm thirsty, so you drink more water, which fixes dehydration. And then it also triggers the posterior pituitary gland, which triggers increased ADH secretion, that antidiuretic hormone, and then that says, hey, take in more water. So it reabsorbs more water, leaves you with more concentrated urine, and then this water helps to fix your dehydration. So here it is again. There's a different version of it. So if you have low blood pressure, what it's going to do is say, hey, I've got low blood pressure. And so it'll trigger the aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. It triggers the aldosterone. And the aldosterone hits the kidney and says, hey, take in more salt and more water, which increases the volume of the blood and helps to increase our blood pressure to fix that low blood pressure problem. So here you go. If it's high, ADH is triggered, which we get more water absorption. And if it's low, then we trigger aldosterone, which increases the water and salt reabsorption and fixes low blood pressure. Again, remember, aldosterone is in the adrenal gland, ADH is in the pituitary gland. All right, finally, the skin, the largest organ in our body, and it does two things. One is thermoregulation, which we talked about for homeostasis, and the other is excretion, which we talked about for our excretory system to help maintain homeostasis. So thermoregulation is regulating temperature. So we already talked about endotherms versus ectotherms. So endotherms, what we are, our internal temperature is not drastically changed by the outside temperature. We maintain our own internal environment, versus ectotherms that are severely affected by the outside temperature, like snakes. 4 steps in heat flow, which play into thermoregulation, and our body has to figure out how to regulate those in order to keep us at the right temperature. One is conduction. Heat just transfers from a higher temperature to a lower temperature. So if you're cold and your friend has warm hands and you hold their hands, the warmth from their hands goes into your hands. That's conduction. And convection is heat transfer by airflow. So if you're standing outside on a cold, windy day, it's going to feel even colder because that air is going to be taking the heat right off your body. Then there's also evaporation. Water leaves bodies as sweat. That's a cooling process. So hot days we sweat, so we get cooled off. And radiation is the loss of heat through the ejection of electromagnetic waves. So all those processes just come to say the skin helps to regulate our temperature. Or the skin also acts as an excretory organ, so it secretes water and salts. It's got 2.5 million sweat glands and 3 layers to it. The epidermis is the top layer. It's covered by dead cells, and that's called the stratum corneum, which is a barrier against microorganisms. Then the dermis, right underneath it, contains all of our sweat glands, our blood vessels, nerves, and oil glands. And then below that is the subcutaneous tissue, or the hypodermis, which is mostly fats. So the skin secretes water and salts through its layers of skin. Final summary, the kidney gets rid of nitrogenous wastes and reabsorbs water and salt, and the skin gets rid of excess salt and water. If you have any questions, please ask.